Well, thank you for coming. I know sometimes lectures aren't high on your agenda, but I tell my daughter, who's a sophomore at Marquette, it's all about the lectures. The classrooms are good, but it's all about who comes because you don't get a chance to see and interact with those people as often as you would like. I'm not a art historian, so you won't have a art historian lecture, right? So I think that may or may not be a good thing depending on your point of view. When Baker told me to have a talk with you guys, I just figured I'd just bring in things that I thought were relevant to my practice. Um, and as an artist, I'm always concerned with what's relevant to me first, and then hopefully it can resonate with other people when the work is being shown, discussed with other people. Okay. Um, all right, so let's just get started. Just art and photography. So everyone here is either a photo, well, you don't have a photo major, but is photography your main thing, or graphic design is your main thing? I'm trying to get a sense of who I'm speaking to. Design. Everyone else? Communications. Both communications and design. Photography. We got any painters, sculptors? Okay. So I guess the rest of you are just kind of just snuck in from someplace. Or you haven't taken up the mantle of who you really are. All right. Okay. All right. So let's get on art and photography. So this kind of Baker kind of broached my first thing to talk about. These kind of like these early debates about photography. Photography is kind of like this literal thing. It was only good for exact depictions of things. Like what was in front of it was the thing that it was going to photograph or make a copy of. It was really thought of a high-tech copy machine, if you can think about it like that, right? But they kind of falls out into three different things here. The first one is utilitarian purpose, literal, exact depiction of things. The second thing is art photography. Now, the maker, not the content, right? Things that appear to be, the photographer wants to make things to be beautiful, so he's really using the camera to photograph paintings, to photograph locations, right? So it's not photography as its own form, but it's a handmade into something else, right? And then the photography that instructs, purifies, or ennobles. The idea that we'll depict a passage from the Bible. We'll depict a story from um, that'll come back to me. But this idea that you want to depict something, tableaus, all right, which my work is really about. My later work, tableau vivants. This idea of raising something up. So photography is still at the use of something else, and it's being depicted or thought about through something else, all right? Don't worry, I do have images. I know we all visual people. So then first art is reproduction. So the idea is that a photographer, his practice would be to go around and photograph these kind of locations. They would be like, beautiful nature pictures, paintings, right? And so as a person who collected these, you could somehow tour Europe without never leaving your home. You would just buy like a stack of prints that would depict different places that you maybe didn't have the money to go to. Photographers at the time thought that they could use this in order to educate people, to entertain people, if you lack those resources to go to these places. Yes, a stereograph would be an example of that, which is like a double image depicting usually the same image, but they kind of speak to each other in a way, right? The idea of stereo viewing. All right. So the early debates also ranged around, people have really strong points of view, all right? So Charles Baudelaire, who was a French poet and critic, his ideas was that photography was really good for record keeping, but for the most part, it had a detrimental effect on the artist, i.e. the painter, right? The painter ended up painting things that was in front of him as opposed to painting things that he imagined or dreamed of, all right? And then the artist on the right, who thought of himself as an artist, Felix Nadar, Nadar, who was like an early celebrity photographer rather. and he photographed the artists, the performers of the day, and he thought of the cameras as an instrument of artistry, and that he had these powers of composition, sensibilities that a painter would have, and he understood that the camera was a way to help him express those things. So here, in a nutshell, you had two very opposing ideas and ways of thinking about photography. One, record keeping, one almost detrimental, right? And there's also photography early on upset painters, because painters saw photography as taking the place of the landscape painter, right? So you no longer needed a painter to do this. If you had a camera, you could do this yourself, right? And it could be done cheaply and fast, right? So from its inception, photography had this way of overturning the apple cart, so to speak, right? And then photography is high art, even then. Mainly British. This is the Oscar, is it Rejander, R-E-J-L-A-N-D-R, who also was trained as a painter, which is you will see this trend. Photographers are trained as painters. They end up going to painting, coming back, going back and forth, either deciding on photographs, using the camera to capture images that they will eventually end up painting, right? And then realizing that the camera works best, works easiest, it's more immediate. So this would be an example of a tableau vivant, where in this particular case, this is the images are photographed. So he would photograph this group first, this group second, and so on, and then on the negative, print them as a scroll, right? So then it would read as one long unfolding narrative, right? But he's also thinking about how, in this case, these are the positions, the routes that young randy lads could aspire to, okay? But you can see he's obviously trying to depict it as a painting, right? So here photography still has not found its own voice yet. It's still thinking about painting first and foremost. How do we copy that? How do we render our photographs that look like paintings, right? Even the form that it takes. If you look at it from a distance, it doesn't even read as a photograph, right? It reads as a painting. Right. So the first challenge that photography has, and in my opinion, when it first steps out on its own as photography, is in pictorialism, which is its main proponent, and one that you should know if you have any interest in photography, would be Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz is East Coast. He's born in Hoboken, New Jersey. He comes from a wealthy family. And he takes up photography, and photography is his main source of inspiration, his main source of creativity. In addition to being a photographer, a champion of photography, he is the person who brings modern art to the Americas. He brings Picasso. He's also a champion and shows George O'Keeffe, a painter who you may know of in New York. So his life is very much intertwined with photography, and pictorialism is how he unfolds his work. And if you need a definition for pictorialism, it's this notion that, black and white photography, which has anyone worked in a dark room before? Okay, so there are these true blacks, and then there's true whites, and everything in between. Pictorialism wants to have everything in the middle, right? So it's all these really soft grays, right? It's really soft focus, and it still wants to be a painting deep down inside, right? So photography throughout the ages has had this stepchild kind of self-confidence problem, I like to say, right? But again, it's still a beautiful photograph, but it's still thinking about painting first and foremost, right? Everything's soft, the tones are gray, and then there's this subject matter that's interested in too. Domestic scenes, women lounging around. You know, everything is really kind of beautiful. Nothing's really severe or direct. Um, it wants to be very poetic in its presentation, right? So this would be a very good example of a pictorialist image. So I like to use this picture. This is a steerage also by Alfred Stieglitz. And it depicts steerage, which here the screen is a little dark, but below you can see the lower class and then above the upper class. And it's a ship that's docking in New York and is bringing immigrants from Europe. And this is the first time that Stieglitz starts to disregard pictorialism and starts to think about the camera, photography, for what it does, which is very direct, it's very crisp, it should be sharp, almost brutal in its depiction of what's in front of it. All right? It's not a typical scene, right? So it's not a beautiful girl or beautiful woman on a dew soaked grass or under a tree or reciting poetry or her eyes closed. It's you know, upper and lower classes on a ship. It's nothing romantic about that at all. It's very direct. It could be considered political in nature as well. All right, but we'll get to that later. All right. Now, so this is what I would say would be like the clean break with pictorialism. And this is how Paul Strand's pictures. This one's called Blind on the left. And then we start to see abstractions being considered as subject matter for photography, right? Also, if we go back to steerage quickly, we also think about the urban landscape as well, right? So there aren't country scenes, there aren't seaside scenes, there aren't this really preoccupation with the sublime. It's really about the city now, right? Because we do have an influx of immigrants. The city has come alive. It's bustling. It's the idea. It's modernism, right? And so now the camera gets turned on that. And Paul Strand, who was associate, and he was a friend of Stieglitz as well. And his is actually his last show that he had at the gallery, I think it's 239, is a Strand show. And this is, like I said, a very strong depiction and a break with pictorialism. This is also, I like that Stieglitz says, these pictures are trying to break with any isms at all right? Art is strewn with isms. Everything's an ism. And so he says these photographs are really breaking with and getting and shaking off the idea of an ism. So, and then this talk is really not going to be I don't want you to think it was a linear talk. It's kind of going to bounce back and forth. I'm really thinking more about the categories that photography falls in. Walker Evans, who is working during the Depression. This is a picture called Ali Mae Burroughs. It's photographed in the Dust Bowl on the West Coast. And it's the first example of a photo essay. All right, and he's teamed with a writer by the name of James Agee, and they go, and the name of the book is called "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men." All right, you may be familiar with that book. All right, so Walker Evans is huge in photography. He's considered a major player, a major artist. This is considered a documentary, and there's a lot of debate about that. If you think about what documentary photography means, most of us think of a documentary photograph or a documentary series as being authentic. All right? There's no artifice in a document. It is what it is, right? But Walker Evans is very much concerned with removing furniture in the Burroughs homes, finding the right backdrop for her portrait. When they would leave their houses, he wanted them to leave sometimes so he could photograph their home in a very still life fashion. And so when this was found out years later, there's a lot of discussion between historians. Are these true documents? Is Walker Evans working as an artist? He thought of himself as an artist, but this is like, it's an interesting debate, and Walker Evans' photographs are really, they are Americana. They are. When you think of an American photographer, you do think of Walker Evans. Now, the Surrealists are my favorite people. You have the Man Ray on the left and the Hans Bueller on the right. The Surrealists are working in 20s, right after the Dadas, who are German in orientation, German in origination. And the Surrealists, like the Surrealist Manifesto, says that that you should primarily be interested in irrational thought. That you should, our beliefs are about irrational above the idea of realism or the truth, right? There's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Art wants to get rid of the middle one, right? Because there is no truth, all right? We play with the truth as artists, right? And the Surrealists also were interested in and inspired by Freud's understanding and thinking about dreams, the subconscious, that art comes from those places, all right? If you can access that, your work will be that much more relevant, real, if there's that word again, real, what is real? But the Surrealists are very much interested in this. And you probably know the painters, Dali. Who was another painter who's a Surrealist? Magritte, yeah, Magritte. Who else? Monroe, all right. So he's Man Ray, Bueller, Belmer, and who else? Oh, he's coming up next. Now, so photography goes from the studio to the street. And this is what I like about photography. It has this, and I'm really biased, so that's just what it is. It has this really wonderful kind of way of being insidious almost, right? You know, it can be many different places, it can serve so many different purposes, good and bad, right? And so photography goes from being planted on the tripod, really big camera, 4x5, under a hood, to a small 35 millimeter photographing from the hip. So with that shift and switch, you get subject matter that, again, is very different. Right? So from the studio to the street, we have pictures like this picture here by Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was associated with the Surrealists, and he believed that he thought that the Surrealists had it wrong. They were making up things in the studio, and he said, well, all you have to do is walk outside. The surreality of life is all I need, right? And that life is, in and of itself is theater, right? And he spent his career pretty much traveling the world looking for these kinds of moments that you see on the screen. The screen is very dark, by the way, so we're missing a lot of information that's happening in between here. Right? But this man here is mimicking the motions here. There's a lot of repeating and reflection in the photograph. And this is made possible by the technical advancements in photography. Again, the large camera to the 35 millimeter. This is Harry Callahan, Chicago, 1946. Also on the street, also thinking about the urban landscape. Harry Callahan, along with Aaron Siskin, are working in Chicago at the Institute of Design, which is now the IIT, which is now mainly an architectural and engineering school. But that school was started by artists, and early on they were really concerned with the idea of experimenting with photography, right? And here he's flattening the picture plane of photography, removing depth of field, using the Chicago landscape to kind of play with the notion of how we see things, our point of view, the idea of perspective, and removing, in this particular case, the ground from our viewpoint. And then when I get further into this, I'll come back to where there are artists today who are working exactly like this. Particularly, his name is Michael Wolff. And he actually came to Chicago. He was at Columbia College, and he would photograph like from one apartment to another. And there's these largest grids. And it just dawned on me when I was putting this together, it's the same work. It's pretty much exactly the same work. There's a different context, all right? And as artists, as you grow in your careers, you'll find that there's something historically that you're working from. There's a different context. There's a different way of situating it. But the work itself is not new, right? And I know oftentimes students are really interested in or maybe preoccupied on newness, right? And I think that newness is overplayed, really overrated. It's really about finding something that's new in yourself and applying it to something that already exists, right? There's very, very few things that are new, right? You can innovate, right? You can change, you can shift context, but things are rarely ever new.
Cecil, this is Jackson.
Right, right. Did you all hear that? Yeah. Yeah, and I hadn't made that connection, but you're right.
This is Jackson High. It's like colored blue.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over. It's
Right. And so if you look at, also wanted to call your attention to the dates here. So, just going back a little bit. So this is 36 and 35. And then we see what Bresson was doing in 32, a few years before. This is Callahan in 46. And then his friend and colleague, Aaron Siskin, in 1949. So again, you can see, I think you can see a really close association of how they're flattening the perspective, right? Here, Siskin is really affected by painters, particularly abstract expressionism. But again, the urban landscape, in this case, peeling paint. I can remember a time when I first started studying photography, it was all about, how close can you get to things, right? And render them abstract, right? And I think that's the problem with studying history too sometimes. You get kind of locked into, this is what a photograph is supposed to look like. And when you get a whole class making similar pictures. And it's because they are reacting to something they saw in the history, right? The thing is, how do you kind of break out of that? All right, so this is Siskin in 49, working in Arizona. Again, this is Callahan in 46. This is my mentor, Roy De Carava, working in 49. So if Siskin was here on this scene, he would have passed up this girl at this sidewalk and went right to that wall and photographed maybe part of the advertisement on the wall, right? Well, of course, Roy De Carava is also trained as a painter, uses the camera to make sketches for his paintings, all right? But he pulls back and he's interested in Harlem as a source of inspiration, right? And he spends most of his career in Harlem making photographs. And I met De Carava in, I think, 91 when he came here for a retrospective at the Art Institute. And I loved his work so much that when I would go to the Art Institute every week to look at different works, and I would take someone different with me, and I would be talking, and the next thing I know, I had like 10 people standing behind me, and then people would thought I was leading a tour. And by the time I got through, it would like be a crowd of people asking me questions, like I worked at the place. But it was simply because I was really enamored with this work, and I understood his kind of sensibility, the idea of improvising, the the idea of the street being a place where things kind of played out, and really enjoying that aesthetic. But this is his picture graduation. Another work that you should be familiar with, and I think is really important and pretty much establishes how most photographers end up working through, I want to say, the 80s. Like if you came to photography through a black and white process, through small camera, you kind of thought about Robert Frank's Americans. Well, that's the name of his book. You should know that book. You should at least look at it. It's in our library. It's in the Trinity Library. I brought it back. And again, so this is 49, 55, 56. So Robert Frank is from Sweden, and he gets a Guggenheim Guggenheim is a really important grant that Baker and I will win one day. And he uses this grant to crisscross back and forth the United States of America. And he's recommended by Walker Evans, who I showed you earlier. And he puts together this body of work that no one in America refuses to, or they won't touch it. They refuse to publish it. And his idea of America is very different than the prevailing notions of America during the 50s. And so he's photographing everyone from bikers to people of color, politicians, anyone that you can think of, bathroom attendants. It's just a really wonderful kind of slice of 1950s America, right? But eventually it catches on, and it becomes like this classic book that all photographers kind of bow to, as a way of, first and foremost, one person's attempt to, because there's this thing, I like to think of creative traits, like what creative traits do you have? And one of them is the ability to work on projects for long periods of time. We in the studio and we trying to get that project done. Usually it's because we've been told to do it when you're a student to get the grade, right? Or you have a real interest in it. But once you're out of school, and there's no one telling you to do the project anymore, what drives you then? Matter of fact, what drives you when you're not getting paid for it, or you don't have a job, right? Do you still work on your projects, your personal projects, with as much energy and dedication? So I think this book is like a testament to that, right? He gets stopped he tells the story of being stopped, I think he's in Alabama. And they pull him over, and you have to remember this is during the communist scare as well. And he pull him over, he has all these rolls and rolls of film. He has these cameras, he has an accent, he's been drinking. He has letters from all these artists, like, who are you, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm photographing the Americans. Really? Yeah. So we probably should pull the film out. He's begging them, don't destroy the film. He calls up Walker Evans to kind of come get him out of jail. So it's like this really wonderful backstory to this particular book. And this is the book that he's pretty much known for. He's done other work as well, but this is the book that everyone knows is the Robert Frank book. And if you got questions along the way, feel free to stop. Remember, let's make this informal. I think this also comes out of that tradition as well. This is Deanne Arbus. I don't know why she pronounces it that way, but Deanne. If you're in the know, you say Deanne. If you don't know, you say Diane, all right? But Deanne Arbus. Child with a Toy Hand Grenade in Central Park, New York City, 1962. There's an interesting proof sheet that goes with this picture. I couldn't find it, though, where you see the photographer working, antagonizing this little boy, right? So that it's like, take my picture already, And if you just look at it without that kind of background, he looks like he's kind of like this weird, kind of crazy little boy, And I love it because we don't give boys grenades to play with anymore, and we don't give them toy guns. You don't do any of that. But this is so common then. But if you know her work, it's based in portraiture, right? But also it's, again, and I didn't mention this earlier, that all these pictures that I've shown, the last maybe 4, except for maybe these 2. Well, this one too. The photographer has turned the camera on culture now, right? So it's all about what's happening in the world and how do we make sense of that, right? But also, how do we make portraits of that? Now, how do you make a portrait of a time, right? And not only make a portrait of a time, but how do you make it timeless, right? So it does not become a relic, but it becomes something that we continue to go back to understand a time that was then, and more important, how do we understand the times that we're in now. But Arbus was very much interested in people what she would call freaks, right? They were called freaks. And it was also this notion, and it's funny now because like a freak then was a person with a tattoo, and it's like, it would be mild in today's, by today's standards. But she had this really interesting method where she would just approach people, which is one thing that photographers have to learn how to do. Painters can, and I joke about, Baker and I, we joke about painters and photographers all the time. But painters can stay in their studios. They don't really have to interact with anyone, right? But when you have a camera, you have to go out in the world and figure out a way to connect with people before you can even begin to photograph them, right? And that's a skill that's developed along with the kind of mechanics of how to use the camera and things like that. But there's this other skill set that's so important to becoming a photographer, especially if you want to deal with people, circumstances, create situations. But I think she had a really wonderful way of doing that and speaking to them, gaining their confidence. How do you get a stranger to let you into their home, right? Now you would probably take out an ad on Craigslist, or you would get a Facebook something or another. But she would just walk with the people on the street, The person with she called them midgets, but we would call them little people, right? Or in this case, she didn't know this boy, but she just kept harassing him, all right? Now he wouldn't even approach a child. It would be kind of odd to do that, So I love that these photographs also kind of speak to our times that we in now, and I really like the way that unfolds through photography. Photography has been a great tool for change. There's this notion that the civil rights movement, we would not have known it happened had we not seen it on TV, right? And photographers are there in droves kind of capturing what's happening, right? And I can remember a time that I kind of came up with older photographers, and their idea of art photography was kind of like these really highly politicized pictures. And when you're a person of color, if you're an artist, you're expected to use your art to deal with political things, right? So you're not going to be photographing trees. Like, why would you do that, Cecil? What is that going to do for us? And you may want to do that, and you may not be a political person. But I can remember when the camera was supposed to do stuff like that. It was supposed to make changes. And so here, this is Ernest Withers, workers assembling for a solidarity march. This is shot in Memphis, Tennessee, and this is like, I think a week before Dr. King is killed in Memphis, and he's there for the garbage workers. And Ernest Withers is interesting. They just did this thing on CNN like a week ago where he's like an FBI double agent. I just thought that was so strange, right? And they're talking to all these people, and they're like, well, we weren't hiding anything. I don't know what they could have been a double agent for, right? But supposedly he would give them information. He would like photograph license plates. So I guess, you kind of feel like he's a traitor. But then I'm like, well, maybe he was a double agent for them too. It's like, sure, I handed you just nothing information, right? Baker and I, we were in New York 2 weeks ago, and there was this painting based on this particular photograph, right? So what happens is the photographs become ubiquitous and so much part of the fabric of the culture that painters will start to look through photographs and find things that resonate with them and make paintings either that are exacting in nature like this, or they try to derive something from the photograph that speaks to a current condition, right? And of course, if you can think today with Egypt, things that are happening in the Middle East, the idea of we're seeing things that come out of those places because of the camera, right? Now it's video as well, and I think video is probably like the next front, right? I think I got a few more here that are talking about that. This famous picture here, children fleeing from a napalm strike, which is kind of like the crystallization and the end of the Vietnam War. And I have seen paintings, I've seen performances, seen many things that are based in this photograph. All right, so we're back to the beginning again, photography and art. All right. Baker and I, we had the chance of seeing a really interesting Warhol exhibition at the MoMA when we were in New York a couple of weeks ago. And this one wasn't on display, but this is all about photography, this picture. It's all about celebrity, right? And which now, celebrity photography, the idea of the celebrity, is so part of our culture and our fabric. I just really think that Warhol was ahead of his time in thinking about that. And here, this is a silk screen, but of course it comes from a photograph of Monroe. And the idea of the diptych. He's also playing with the preciousness of art, right? Art in this way, art is no longer this precious object. It's meant to be, replicated. It's meant to be duplicated. It's meant to be reproduced over and over and over again. It has no stuff anymore. It's not special, right? It's the picture that it is of is what makes it special, but it's not special as an object anymore, right? When I came to photography early on and I saw this picture, I kept thinking, what is so special about this picture, right? It's not particularly interesting as a composition, what it's supposed to be about. But then I realized once I learned more, I realized he's speaking about another thing, right? So his photography kind of cannibalizing itself, right? And here photography is like a performance base. It's all about the performance. So it's like a document again, right? So I love how photography kind of keeps going back to its origins, right? And that's okay. That's part of its power, right? And so this is Bruce Norman's self-portrait of a fountain, which is commenting on and inverting Duchamp's urinal piece, right? Everybody know what that piece is, Duchamp's urinal piece, right? So, which is Duchamp talking about the art object has no authorship, right? The art object, depending on where you place it, gains its currency, right? And then here Newman is making himself the fountain, right? A self-portrait which is of the self, being the fountain, right? So it's like using photography, one, to connect back to another artist, right? It's kind of like this vehicle, you kind of go back and forth between the two, right? It's a document, right? It's proof that I was once a fountain, right? Because if you weren't there to see the performance, whether it was meant to be public or private, it was still a performance. If you wasn't there to see that, the photograph exists as proof of that, right? And then within the photograph, the positioning, its point of view, the lighting, all those things that come into play that may change and alter the original performance, right? So I just love photography. It's kind of like tentacles and all of that. And it's kind of pulling it apart, putting it back together, and kind of playing with the notions of what all it can do. And it really goes back to when I first opened up, thinking about photography as this kind of, how do you use it, right? And once you know what you can use it for, then you can start to pull it apart and use it for what things that you needed to do, right? And then you can just throw out the history, all right? Oh, it's okay, Baker, all right? It's all right. You throw out the history, but it's after you've learned it and after you really understand it, right? You throw it out, you make what you need to make, and then well, guess what? After you made it, you go back and you look, you kind of go back and forth to the history again, all right? So you don't really throw it out, but you shouldn't be like in your head while you're making it, all right? You kind of learn it and move on. All right, so then we go into the postmodern idea, and Baker talked about these Cindy Sherman pictures, these Cindy Sherman untitled film stills, right? Again, another picture when I was new to photography, I kept thinking, why is this picture so important? What makes this picture what it is, right? Again, it's Cindy Sherman performing, right? She's not playing dress up, right? But she's the modern woman, right? Film stills, right? So we are a generation, or you are a generation that has been pretty much bred on and raised on the internet, social media, the digital age, right? I'm right before that generation where it was TV, films, and like magazines everywhere, right? And then there's a break before that, like post-World War II people who didn't have any of those kinds of things. So you get all these kinds of gaps, right? So Cindy, in this picture, to me, in my opinion, she's thinking about the role that TV played, right? There's also things, you can think of this as a feminist way of looking at the world, right? So she's not her mom's woman. She's this new woman, this modern woman, which in today's world looks kind of odd, right? But we think about the time that the picture was made in. Clearly, that's what she's interested in. She's interested in the role of the woman, right? And then we also start to think about the idea that women are to be looked at. She's playing that role. Look at me, right? Looked at by men. Let's see what else I got here. Sherry Levine's appropriate. Yes, go ahead, man.
Go back to that last one.
All right.
So we were talking about, this stuff is upstairs in the RDC.
Yeah.
All photographers were complaining about print quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of goes back to the idea of preciousness. So if you come through photography through Ansel Adams, we all know who he is, right? You know, the idea of the photograph being this beautiful, precious, the idea of connoisseurship, right? That things have, what word am I looking for? Preciousness, I like that word, all right? So clearly, I mean, Cindy was like terrible in photo one. Like she barely got out of the class. I would have failed her. I would have failed Cindy Sherman, right? Like you just don't have it, right? So her pictures are like these, like kind of badly exposed images. They're not really that good when we think about what a photograph is supposed to do, right? And it's this really wonderful thing that happens in the late 70s and early 80s. That stuff goes out the window, right? Because again, since it's not precious, why do we care so much? It should be about what it's depicting. And in this case, the idea took precedence over the idea of this beautiful, beautiful image, right? And then it's photographed in a way where she's holding the camera like down below, right? So then who's supposed to be doing the looking at her? Right? And then why is she presented in such this large in life kind of way? And if you look, and if you know this film stills body of work, they all have this kind of barely producible, barely done well kind of quality to them, right? And then they're like small little guys too. They're like these little 8x10s, right? Which is not what we think about when we think about what photography is supposed to be today, right? These large, like beautiful works. And I was just being tutored by these guys who were like these really old crankety photographers, and they were like, oh man, this is what's in the museum now, and this was like the first picture that made it upstairs in the Art Institute. It wasn't in the basement, right? And it wasn't even in the photography, it was in the art section, which is another kind of weird kind of relationship that we kind of get from this picture. All right, but it's it's interesting to think about that. So you remember I showed you the Walker Evans original of this. So Sherry says, well, I don't even need a camera anymore. I'll just photocopy Walker Evans' picture, all right? And that's the art, which starts to open up a whole nother can of worms, all right? So now the artist doesn't even need the camera anymore. All I can do is just play with the actual photographs. Because if you think about it, in today's world, we got millions and millions and millions of photographs. Why are you in school trained to make more? Right? Why do you need to make more of them? Right? You don't really. I need a picture of a guy pulling off the internet. We pull stuff off the internet for everything, right? So why we need more pictures? But she's also thinking about the idea of the authorship, right? The photographs, you really can't make a new photograph because you're pretty much making photographs of something you've seen already. So why not go to that source and grab it, right? She's also talking about male, the idea of the patriarchy in photography, in art, the male, and these are all, she did a whole series of appropriations, and they're all like the big guys in photography. Walker Evans, Weston, Edward Weston, Walker Evans, who else does she do? But she kind of takes them on, just takes their work, photocopies it, and puts it in the museum, right? And it is celebrated because of these things that it starts to investigate. So it's really interesting to think about photography playing that role as well. You don't need a camera, just use the image. I don't have to make another image, just use what's already available, right? And we see appropriation all the time now, all right? But in the early, I think these came out early 80s, it's like really kind of a different way to think about things. Well, because I think we still harbor the notion that the artist is supposed to be this singular genius who kind of stands in front of something and projects his genius onto something. And we revel in that. We applaud it. And it's singular. It's not something that could be easily copied, right? Why would we celebrate that? All right, but she's taking that thing and she's kind of turning it on its head. Right? So what's new? Nothing's new, man. I know you came here for new stuff, but it's nothing new. All right, but I did bring together some stuff that I thought you'd be interested in. So this is the work I did in Lucerne, Switzerland this summer. It's a series of work called Looking for Baldwin, and it's I'm using the literary source as my inspiration. Right? I am not James Baldwin, but I share many similarities with him. All right, he's at this time he's working in the 50s. I wasn't born yet. All right, but I know from which he came, and I understand those circumstances, so we do share similarities in that way. And my idea was to go to Lucerne, where he finished a book called Giovanni's Room, which I read as a 16-year-old, as a junior in high school, a book that really stuck with me and kind of changed my way of thinking about the world. And understand that people of color actually lived in places like France and Germany, and they traveled, and I'm this kid that lives on the south side of Chicago. I have a nice life, but it's quiet. I'm like right there, the hip hop generation. I got turntables and a mixer for Christmas. All right, so that's my life, right? And I understood I wanted to be an artist. I thought I was going to be a musician. Wasn't sure what I was going to be. I knew I wanted to do something with music, and I understood I needed to do something with my hands, right? So mixing and helping my friends produce records were like the things that I did. But Baldwin, Malcolm X, people like that really kind of changed my way of thinking about the world. And so I wrote this proposal that I would go to Switzerland and figure out a way to connect to him through his writings, through his text. And here I'm using photography, again, as a way of looking back at myself, using the man's image, placing his image in the landscape. I also created like banners and stencils. And so I would make these 10, 12-foot strips of his text and find places in the landscape and to photograph them as well. So I thought of photography as a performance thing, right? It helped me record things that I was thinking about, right? And then I just happened to make them beautiful, they easy to digest as well, right? So this is, so again, if you think back to the things that we just looked at, I'm looking at appropriation. I'm also using someone's image who I do not know who this person is. I just pulled it off the internet too, right? Took it to the printer, made a print, walked around like it was my picture, put it up, right? So there was something interesting about that. I had never done that before, right? It took a long time for me to use photographs that were not my own, all right? And again, literary references, thinking about how do I use the literary to draw from and render images from. This is a friend of mine, Howard Henry Chin, who's part part Chinese, part Vietnamese, and he's really a wonderful guy I went to grad school with. And his whole life he thought was dominated by the memory of Vietnam, right? Not that he experienced it personally, but it was always in his house. It's all his father talked about. So he made these trips back and forth to Vietnam during grad school, and he made photographs of tourists using sites that soldiers fought at, things that were left over from the war. They're now tourist destinations, tourist sites there. And he thought it was interesting that something that caused so much terror, sorrow, in both countries were now considered these places where Americans would go to visit as part of their vacation plan, right? And he would go and make these kind of diptychs. And it's also a way of dealing with growing up an American but missing this whole part of yourself that's in another land. Another friend of mine, his name is Cole Robertson, who's using, it's the WWF. Cole doesn't use photography. He's a photographer, but he doesn't use a camera at all. These are internet images from wrestling matches from, is it the WWF? I don't know what, yeah, but there's like these big, over the top, you know, and he thinks that they're kind of like gay eroticism. He likes this kind of play on it. And so he takes, he's one of those kind of guys. So he takes their images and he kind of uses like this really beautiful washes of paint and paints over them. And he, you know, they obviously kind of posed in certain ways, right? And they're like, if I didn't tell you where they came from, they're kind of like they're like these kind of beautiful little, you know, gentle kind of, you know, paintings. But he takes them from the internet, and all his work comes from the internet. And then sometimes you have people send him pictures, and then he kind of plays with. So I like that idea of using the digital age. Although he's maybe 10 years younger than me, but we were in the same class. Again, he sees I don't need to make any more pictures. Everything I need is on the internet, you know. Why are you still, he's like, you're like an old man. Why are you still using the camera, you know? This is a body of work I did in Peoria, where I'm interested in thinking about the works of Jeff Wall and Gregory Crewson, where you are creating these tableaus. And these are two of my children here. I have 3 girls. And we kind of held up in a factory for a month. We didn't live there, but we stayed there for a month. And I would drive back and forth to Chicago and pick them up on the weekends. And we kind of played out these tableaus, right? That they either helped me on or I thought about. I was thinking about children's narratives, children's stories. How can I play with that? Man, when my picture's up, I'm really more concerned with the screen now. You know, at first it was like, oh, okay, it's all right, but now it's like it's just way too dark. But you can see more information in there. Right? But anyway, we worked with I had a small team of like 5 people, and we worked with everything from installing those lights. My daughters kind of played with drawing and worked on algebra computation they were working on in class throughout the entire stall. It's like used to be an elevator shaft, this thing right here, right? So So again, thinking about photography, I like that. I've noticed that I'm thinking about photography a lot as a way of helping me through performances, right? Documenting my performances, thinking about the idea of this is something I'm doing, this is something I want to capture, it's happening, boom, it happened, and now move on, right? And that's really, so as a photographer, you really want to start to think, how does photography best serve your sensibilities, right? To me, that's the first thing. The historical, the theoretical things support that, right? Because you're not creating out of a vacuum, right? You're just not in your own head, right? You exist in a time and a place, and those times and places need to support, right? Inform the things that you attempt to do. And hopefully the things that you do come out of your natural sensibilities, which guess what, are always changing as you grow older, right? And they also change the more things you learn, right? This is Matt Sieber, who also went to grad school. He was 2 years ahead of me. And he showed at our galleries here maybe about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when we had Sieber there. Yeah, yeah. So Sieber is very interested in the text in the landscape, how we're inundated with advertisements, what that does to our consciousness, how it affects our decisions, right? The things we see on a daily basis, right? And of course, he's rooted in digital photography, not only digital photography as a form of capture, but how digital photography can help change the image, right? So he's removing obviously the pole that keeps up these signs, right? But how these signs, they become, I do a test in one of my art appreciation classes where it's called the advertisement light box. Has anyone ever seen that piece? It's like 20 logos of famous images, and you go through and name each one. And I don't care what class it is, everybody can name all 20. You know, it's like everything from the M&M logo to the Tide logo to the, of course, McDonald's logo. But all these kinds of symbols that are, and he just travels up and down the landscape of the country, and he just finds these kind of places where they're ubiquitous. But the way he takes in his play on them really changes at least for me, it changes my understanding and my relationship to the signs and the things that pollute the landscape. It's a bunch of it, right? It's a bunch of it. I think, okay. So this is the Michael Wolff piece I was talking about. To me, it looks like Harry Callahan, right? Except now it's in color, right? Clearly, through the title Architecture of Density, is really about how you pack, how much you can pack into these really small, dense places. He does these pictures all over the world. He did a series here in Chicago, and they exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. But I just know he had to look at Callahan's pictures of this kind of, he had to have seen those, right? And, when I was younger, I used to think, well, no, you can't do that because you're copying. Somebody already did it. I can't do it. But it's like so wrong and wrong-headed to even think that. Now I'm just informed as to what those things, what they were, what came before, right? And then when you do it, it has to be different because you're in a different time, you're in a different place, right? But the people that you speak to, the people you show your work to, will expect that you would know that Callahan did those type of things, right? As opposed to you thinking you have something totally new and shiny and new. It's like, look what I did, right? So when I saw this, I'm like, oh, okay, this is Callahan. This is Callahan, All right, I know I've been talking a lot. I read somewhere that after 20 minutes, people need something to do. They have to say something, get up or do something. They start to go to sleep and think about dinner if you keep talking after 20 minutes. Are there any questions or anything that's come up that you would like to discuss? Yes. I'm sorry? What got me interested in photography? You know what? I've always been a very visual person. I didn't understand that that came from cameras, though, which is kind of weird to think about that. That you're always visualizing things, but the things that you see come from either still cameras or video or film cameras, right? And I need, you know what? I stumbled upon it. I needed to fill out my schedule my senior year. I said, I need something easy to do. Let me take some pictures. So whenever I get a person who comes to my class because they need something easy to do, I always hope to convert them. And then I became converted. I said, boy, I should have done this for my life. My life is over. I'm sorry, I can't go back, right? And I just made photographs on my own and taught myself photography after undergrad. Are you dealing with anything that you want to talk about as far as anything on your work, anything that's bothering you, anything that you're interested in? Anything. It doesn't have to be about my talk. Yes?
Just kind of a question about your process of working on ideas and stuff. Do you normally find that you're working on multiple projects at a time?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you kind of get into a groove of just working on one thing, and just kind of pushing that until you kind of can't go anymore, and then you go for another?
Yeah, that it's not an easy answer to that. Sometimes, like right now, the residencies have helped me understand the importance of focusing energy on one project at one time. Artists have a tendency to jump around because we get bored, right? And I've learned that boredom is a sign that I need to concentrate harder on the thing that's in front of me. It doesn't mean I go do something else, because I'll get bored with that too, right? But the residencies kind of opened up my mind to that. And the reason it was because I could accomplish 20 pieces in 30 days and have them printed, ready for a show before I even got back home. Whereas I just kind of bounced around, it would be a year before anything materialized. I said, okay, this is how I need to work. And so now residencies, the Baldwin work, I shot it in the summer. I came back, concentratedly worked on it, and I'm showing it next month at the Union League. So it's good to, I don't want to preach to you. You have found your own way, but I think it's better to focus your time on one project at a time. And what you do for those things, the other things that come up, that's what your journal is for. That's what your idea book is for, right? Because you always have an ideas. I'm not saying shut those down, but you just list them, right? And what happens is when you're ready to work, they're already done. That's how I got the residency in Switzerland. I had already wrote the proposal for the Baldwin thing. I knew I wanted to do it at some point in my life. I just wrote it up, what the pictures would look like. I storyboarded it, right? Doing lunch and stuff, storyboard what they would be. If I had everything I needed, what would the pictures look like? Where would I go? Who would I photograph? And so when the thing came across my desk, it was already ready. I just had to finish it, make it look good, right? And I already had other pictures that were good that show what I did, and I sent it off. Yeah. So work on one thing at a time, all right? Yes. All right.
Let's take about 5 or 6 minutes
Mhm.
to get a breather,
Okay.
and then we'll go with anybody who wants to come. We're going to start with Janae's work, and Cecil's going to talk to Janae about her stuff. You can listen if you want.
Okay. Cool.
We got a list of folks to go through.
All right. And my email address is cecilmcdonald@mac.com. My whole name, Cecil McDonald at mac.com. If there are questions that come up, things that you want to have answered,